Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into episode 3 of the Christian Libertarian podcast. Appreciate you joining. And I would like to say happy birthday, America. It's July 4th, Independence Day. Great day to be an American, proud to be an American. I know a lot of people are prouder, and others certainly aren't after the week that we had with the Supreme Court, the different rulings. Certainly there, talk about those things. And so I'll just dive right into those different rulings and kind of a deep dive in there. I'm actually going to start with the one that I think got the least amount of coverage, and that was a case where there was a Christian United States postal worker who took the job because didn't have to work on Sundays. He was a former missionary, came back to the United States and said, hey, great place to work. Don't have to work on Sundays. You can observe a Sabbath, even though traditional Sabbath was practiced Friday at sundown to Saturday at sundown. But anyway, Christians can, you can do Sabbath whenever, I guess. It's your choice, certainly. But anyway, so he took the job under that pretense. And then in 2013, the United States Postal Service took a contract from Amazon, who does deliver on Sundays. And so, of course, now that they had opened it up, he was expected to work certain Sundays. Now, his supervisors and everything gave him exemptions. He said, hey, I took this job under this pretense. I want to be able to observe my religious Sabbath. And the United States Postal Service, at the beginning was like, okay, it's fine. And he covered all the other shifts. He made it so that, okay, other people could cover Sundays. It was all good. And then starting in 2018, it was found a little bit more difficult to find people for Sundays, which, again, in a free market system, you would just pay people more. But again, this is government getting involved in markets, so that's always fun. But he started to get written up, and he had missed, I think, 24 Sunday shifts by the time they eventually let him go. And then he sued to say, hey, you didn't accommodate his religious beliefs. And the president at the time, going into this, there was a 1977 case, which was, what's a trivial in terms of what should you accommodate for. So, for instance, if let's say you're talking about a Muslim who needs to pray a couple times a day during the workday. I know they do morning at night, and then I think a few times during the workday. I know they pray 5 times facing east towards Mecca, but again, what those 5 times are, not exactly sure. 2 to 3 times during the workday, a place to do it. That's not very hard to accommodate in that regard, especially in an office job. Okay, a closet here, a bathroom, wherever you would do that. That's not very difficult. Another thing would be, hey, if you need a place to pray, if you need that, basic things like that. But in terms of the precedent at the time saying that, hey, you never have to work this day, that was kind of a free market choice of an agreement that you came with your employer. Now, in the case of this individual, this United States postal worker, his argument was that it was kind of an implied agreement that, hey, USPS doesn't deliver on Sundays, so don't even have to worry about my religious beliefs, I guess. But then they changed it. So for different arguments on both sides of this, saying that, hey, look, when a job description, job roles change, it's not necessarily that, hey, they have to keep the old binding agreements. It's just that you would get the first crack at the new job, right? So, for instance, if let's say they require people to move for a job, let's say your company's based in New York and they decide to move all the people to like Nashville, Tennessee, for instance, that's certainly a tough thing. A lot of move, certainly that's a lot to expect out of people. But at the end of the day, you can choose to, hey, move to Nashville or find new employment. And so I think the argument there by the people against this worker was, hey, look, the USPS just made a new job. He was given first crack. Now the new job required work on Sundays. That's an interesting argument. I mean, so what the Supreme Court said, essentially in this ruling, was that, okay, no, they should have done more to accommodate this individual for his religious beliefs, especially because when he was brought in, they didn't have to deliver on Sundays. And so I think that had to do part of it. Some people were referencing other cases, like, so for instance, taxi cab drivers were checking people's suitcases yeah, for alcohol because they couldn't deliver alcohol based on religious beliefs, and so they were saying no, you can't do that. And this was another case, or this was another situation. I think in New York or Minneapolis or some sort of area, but it was like, yeah, part of the job of taking the job as a taxi cab driver is you're gonna drive people. Now, of course, you don't want to deliver illegal things like drugs. Like, for instance, if someone had a suitcase full of cocaine and you knew about it, you could deny that person that that's aiding and abetting in potential drug trade. There certainly you don't want to do that. But alcohol, that's not illegal. You don't know what someone's going to have in their bag, but should your beliefs stop you from doing that? Again, I think it's part of the job, right? But again, in terms of this USPS job, certainly it was the case where the expectation was you weren't going to work Sunday. Now they're forcing you to. So it's a little bit different of a case. One that wasn't talked about as much, but certainly could have a wide range of impacts on workplace environment in terms of religious accommodation. I certainly don't think that. Again, you think about different religions, right? You think about a Muslim person praying. I think most workplaces would certainly accommodate for that, praying again 2-3 times a day. Maybe having options if let's say you work in a large office building, to have maybe a kosher option, a halal option for food, certainly. But I don't think they would go as far as you could only do that, because again, you could have a mishmash of religions. For instance, if you were to serve beef, maybe some traditional Hindus who work in an office might say, well, no, you can't serve that. And then a Jewish person might say, well, you can't serve pork. And then you'd get into a whole thing. So maybe certain options are saying that, hey, look, you could always bring your own lunch. No one's stopping you from bringing your own lunch. So that'd be an interesting thing there. I just wanted to bring that up because it was certainly a one that wasn't talked about as much, because there were some other larger ones. Another one that definitely didn't get as much of attention is this Christian web developer or website developer who did not want to make one for gay weddings, kind of like the or just I think gay people in general, perhaps, or maybe gay weddings, kind of harking on the wedding cake incident. And the result of that, the result of this case was they sided with the website developer, saying that you don't have to make the website for the gay person. Now, certainly some people came out that said, oh, that's ridiculous. You can't discriminate on your services. Now, I think the difference when it comes to a cake or when it comes to a website is that's compelled speech, right? Let's say I owned a factory and I were to print like blank white shirts, or produce automobiles, for instance. Regardless of who buys those, there's no compelled speech. Like, I'm not forced to say or do anything. I just sell an automobile, or I just sell a t-shirt. But if, let's say, I were a sign maker, I could say, well, let's say, you have a Republican sign maker, Democrat comes in, or vice versa, Democrat comes in, Republican sign, whatever. They could say, well, no, I don't want to do that speech because that goes against what I believe, right? I'm being the one printing that speech. I think that's really where the crux of that case belongs, is it's that forced speech. A lot of arguments are saying, well, now, if let's say there was some actor, I think on The Sopranos or something, some guy, I think he very much misinterpreted the case. He was saying is, well, saying that, hey, no bigot can watch my stuff. That has nothing to do with the Supreme Court case. It's the compelled speech. First of all, they're not saying that like a business owner could just deny someone based on the race, just like, a Supreme Court case we'll get into, certainly, but it's the compelled speech, right? No one can compel you to say anything. Certainly, like this actor, I forget the guy's name, but I think he was in Sopranos. You could look the guy up. But certainly no one is forcing him to be an actor role he didn't want to. So let's say there were, I don't know what race or religion he is, but certainly he's probably against Nazism, for instance. So I don't think anyone would force him. I don't think he would want to be forced to be in a role that would glorify Nazis, for instance. I don't think anyone would want to be in that, or maybe some crazies out there would do that. But he wouldn't want to be forced to do that. And I think that's where this case is. It's where, hey, I I don't want to make a cake or a website for this gay wedding. Now, let's say it's just, you know, a basic code. Let's say you're selling a package that has nothing to do with speech, and it's the same speech, whether it's a straight person, a gay person, a black person, whatever, it's the same across the board. Then I don't think you should be able to deny that. Again, under the Civil Rights Act, against 14th Amendment, all those things, certainly, equal under the law. You can't be discriminated against. Um, like, so for instance, if I go into Walmart, someone can't say, well, you can't buy tortillas. Again, Walmart, of course, wants to sell as many tortillas as possible. It makes good business sense to do so, because they want to sell as much stuff as possible. They don't want to deny that, but I don't think they should be able to do that. But if, let's say, I went to the Walmart cake department and said, hey, bake me a cake with like the ISIS flag on it, I think Walmart would have every right to say, no, you can't tell us what speech that we're going to put on something. And I think that's the crux of it, is this forced speech item. And I think that's maybe some people who read into it are misinformed about this, certainly. But again, compelled speech is a thing where I think you can discriminate on. But like a basic service, like AT&T can't discriminate. Even at the highest, like, oh, this person's a Nazi, they can't cut your phone service, even if you were to talk to someone. Like, you offer phone service. However someone uses it, that's up to them. On that. So enough about that. We'll go into the big ones. So the first is the first one I want to talk about is the student loan debt forgiveness. I've actually talked about that on the first two podcasts about what I think is going to happen with there. There were some other Supreme Court cases the previous week that some people were saying, oh, maybe they're going to forgive it, or because of jurisdiction or trying to prove damages. But no, it is what I thought it would be, and the executive branch certainly couldn't forgive the debt. And if you think about constitutional powers, it made no sense that the executive branch could do this, because the purse strings of the country are controlled by Congress. And even so much so that Nancy Pelosi in 2021, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe it was 2019, 2021, but she said this, and in fact, this was quoted by Chief Justice Roberts, that it's up to Congress to determine student loan debt forgiveness. Similar to, let's say, PPP loans during the COVID crisis, which, again, this podcast wasn't going on at that time, but I was very much against those. They were riddled with fraud and a lot of issues. For instance, a lot of the people that needed PPP loans certainly couldn't get them because of the bureaucratic processes involved with AML, KYC, all the banking stuff. For instance, if you were unbanked or your bank didn't offer PPP loans, you had to go to, let's say, a Wells Fargo. Actually, I think Wells Fargo had some issues with loan maximum, so a lot of people had to go to JP Morgan Chase, and if you weren't a customer, you had to go through the AML KYC process, versus if you were already a customer, they already did that process, so they could just, send you the money. Who were more likely to already be within that process? Well, more well-to-do companies, and so it killed the mom and pop shops who either banked at a local credit union or people who weren't doing PPP loans. Besides the point, constitutionally, Supreme Court, if let's say someone sued the U.S. government for PPP loans, or to say, hey, this was an unconstitutional program, the Supreme Court, even if they were all personally against the program, they would go 9-0 because Congress did it. Right? And this is a key piece of the Supreme Court. Their job isn't to determine if something's right or wrong, the success or failure of a program. Some might want it to be that way, or some might want to use it as a way to push in legislation or push in ideas that they want, and then they get upset or mad if they don't get it. Certainly, we've seen that today on the left side of the aisle, or this past weekend, certainly Friday, a lot of that. The Supreme Court's job is to look at the means at which something is done. So most people are aware of the phrase, the ends justifying the means. A lot of people on the left side of the aisle, in fact, this has been going on for a long time. In fact, there was a South Park episode way back, I think in 2002, 2003. I actually know the episode name. It was Future Self and Me. Look up that episode, and there was a small little joke in there that said, what us liberals say, the ends always justify the means. And of course, that's not true. You could take the extreme example of, well, we ended child hunger. Great. We ended child hunger. That's an unbelievable thing. That's something we've wanted to do forever. Well, how did you do it? Oh, we just killed all the hungry children. Obviously, that's way worse than, some children being hungry, because at least they're still alive. Of course, very extreme example. Of course, people would say that's a terrible thing, but it proves the point there that, of course, the ends don't always justify the means. The means are very important. And in this case, in the Supreme Court, their job is to not look at the ends, but the means themselves, right? Can a government body do this? Can a private corporation do this? Can the legislative branch do this? Can the executive branch do this? Can the state government do it? City government, whatever, whatever. And so the very first thing they're going to look at is the Constitution, right? That's, of course, that's the granddad of them all. That's the foundational document of this country. No one's going to argue that. Or maybe some people would, some crazies, but certainly foundational document. Like if let's say a state were to say, hey, we're going to ban free speech, I don't think it would make it to the Supreme Court. I think a lower level justice would or a lower level judge would say, are you serious? They would just throw it out. They would say, obviously, you can't do this. But you never know. Or I think the voters or the legislator or the governor, somewhere along the process, he'd be like, obviously, we can't do this. But if it got to the Supreme Court, they'd say, okay, this state tried to ban free speech. The First Amendment says you can't ban free speech, so obviously we're going to overturn this law. It would never get to the Supreme Court, hypothetical example. They look at, can you do something? Can you not do it? They don't look at, oh, this was a successful program, or, oh, this was a good thing, oh, this was a bad thing. And the reason for that, and I think it's very smart, our framers of this country weren't morons. I think they were very intelligent people. Their whole thing, they understood that if the Supreme Court's job was to look at the success or failure of country of let's say a specific program, a specific law, then there would be subjective measures. And certainly they could be influenced by the political nature at the time. So, let's say student loan debt forgiveness, people wanted it would be a very successful thing. People would get out of debt. People would do all these things. Let's say, again, I personally am against it. I mentioned it in the previous podcast, how I would replace this system, how it would be a lot better. So go back and watch that first podcast if you want to hear a little bit about that. But essentially, that's not what they care about. They don't care about, oh, this is a very, great program. It's going to help all these people. No, their job is to say, can the executive branch, because this was started at the executive branch. This was a executive order by Joe Biden, so clearly very top of the executive branch. Can the executive branch do this? Now, the argument by the executive branch was, hey, well, because of the HEROES Act and the CARES Act that allowed some government spending, there was some wiggle room there, so okay, therefore we can do it. It was a very flimsy argument. Some people might say it was a strong argument. It was a very flimsy argument because it didn't give them that power. There was at all. It didn't give them that power at all. To do that. The argument against it was, well, the executive branch doesn't have the power to, of the purse strings of the country. They don't have the power to get rid of debt. I think Congress has granted the power of the executive branch to get rid of certain debts, or I think there are certain acts that maybe they could do it, but there's a whole program involved. I think it's the Higher Education Act, I believe, allows some wiggle room there, but it's a very difficult process. And unfortunately, we live in a world of insane political expediency. Everyone wants to do the most simple, easy solution, when in reality, it might require more political willpower. But if you do it the correct way, it's going to stand the test of time unless it's a truly moronic system. So, for instance, the example I want to give here is the 18th Amendment. For those of you who don't know, that's banning of alcohol. That's what started prohibition. And certainly very unpopular, but it passed, right? It took, 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of states, which at that time I believe was 32 states out of 48, passed it. It ratified in their state governments. And it was spearheaded by a bunch of puritanical women, which, mind you, they couldn't vote back then. So it wasn't like they were, ballot stuffing. They weren't doing all this stuff. They couldn't vote. And they were able to get this 18th Amendment passed. Now, of course, prohibition, terrible idea. The 20s, wrought with crime. The mafia grew, terrible thing. And then they got rid of it with the 21st Amendment. But think about it. In order to ban alcohol, they had to do a constitutional amendment, which means to undo it, it took a constitutional amendment. And so they did it the right way. They did it the right process, even though the decision was moronic. It was a stupid decision. They did it, at least they did it the right way, right? So now we go back to student loan debt forgiveness. If they want to do it the right way, they don't have to get 2/3 of Congress. They don't have to get 3/4 of states to ratify anything. They just need 51 senators. And I know people will say, oh, well, there's the filibuster. They'd figure out a way. And then, half of 435 so whatever that number is, 270, I think, something like that. No, it's some number, or maybe 435, 218, yes, 270 is the electoral college. So 218 to get the majority in the House, and then needed the president to sign off on it. Now, if they don't have the approval of the president, they could then get 2/3 of Congress and override the veto, and they could do that. So there is a political way to do it, and there's a right way to do it. And even if you are personally against the student loan debt forgiveness, which I am, I think that they should overhaul the system, certainly. I would be more okay with it if they did it the right way, because that is how the framers built our country. It takes political willpower to actually get things done, to actually grow government power, because that's what it would do. It would give the power of the government to forgive these loans and empower these people. And certainly people would say, oh, how's that giving government power? Well, it sets a future precedent of, oh, well, we're just going to forgive debt again, right? Yeah, we do it in, let's say, 2023, but who's to say in 7 years from now, 2030, that they're not going to forgive the debt again? Of more people, or maybe people that were students at the time, didn't have debt forgiven, and now they need it, and so on and so on. So it opens up the can of worms there. And so the framers understood that there was a right process to do things, and they have to follow the process. And it takes enough political willpower, it takes enough people to vote for it. And if you actually take a look at the polling numbers, certainly I think, maybe it's a little bit majority of the country, but it's a slim majority. But then if you break it down, of course, college graduates who have student loan debt, of course they want it. Right? It'd just be like, hey, who wants $10,000 given to you just out of blue? Of course, everyone would just take it. Of course, if there were no strings attached, it was just like, hey, you as a person want 10 grand? Of course, who wouldn't want 10 grand in that case? But if you actually take a look at the demographics, if you take a look at the income breakdown, it's the people that are at the bottom, right? The people who are not making too much money, don't have a college degree. Of course, they're against it because their taxes go up, or inflation goes up to cover this, or there's more debt that gets added on, or whatever the case is, right? They end up having to pay for it. And you're going to say, hey, someone who makes $30,000 a year doing whatever needs to pay for some $20,000 off someone who's a doctor who makes $300,000 a year. And sure, they might have $200,000 in student loans. Well, maybe not in that example, because I think it's $125,000 of income, more or less. So, okay, someone who makes $120,000 of income, maybe they have $50,000, or let's say $20,000 in student loan debt. That person that makes 4 times the person making $30,000 is getting a $20,000 debt, got off the books. So now, they can get even way further ahead. So in the past, it was, hey, go to college, get ahead. And that's, I think that's a decent thing. But again, what were the majors of people in the 50s and 60s and 70s? Well, certainly maybe different. Or I think certainly back then, college, if we go back even further to like the 1910s and 20s, college for most people, especially the private universities, weren't about the knowledge that you would learn in the courses. It was more about the relationships you'd build. It was about the networking. So you went, let's say you were a son of a business owner in, let's say upstate New York. You went to, one of the big universities. Let's say you went up to Boston. I think that's Harvard's in Massachusetts and Boston. You go up there, you network with all these people, you meet people from all over the area, and you either have your job secured, or you're going to meet someone that, hey, I need this bright young person to work for me. It was a networking thing. And so people were just there to, goof off, learn. But the biggest thing was not necessarily the stuff that you learned. It was learning how to learn. It was, really strengthening that muscle in reading a lot of the ancient texts and reading and thinking and, all this critical thinking and debate and all these important skills that you could then apply to your workforce or, your job in the workforce. And so, yeah, let's say you ended up working in like steel metal, metallurgy, or you worked in factory, or you were, a business person working on the New York Stock Exchange, whatever it was. You probably didn't learn that in your university courses, but you learned how to learn, you learned how to communicate, and you learned, kind of the way that people interacted in kind of this sort of higher society, because who all was going to college? Well, it was typically richer people were going to college. It was the state universities that were providing the hard sciences, like the engineering. You think about a school like Texas A&M, right? The very good mechanical engineering program there. That's kind of how it is, or how it was, excuse me, at all these schools where it was, hey, look, the hard sciences, like getting into a state school was, again, not as difficult as this day because the demand was less, but certainly there was, that was the point of these schools, was to actually get people ahead, and not the networking, but so you could provide value. And it was an extension. And earlier on, they were subsidized, certainly. But now there's a little bit less subsidies, which I think is actually makes sense. I think they should compete. But really, what would cause universities to be so expensive in the first place, and out of all this, is the student loans themselves. If there were no student loans, people would say, oh, well, then how would any poor person go to college? Well, I mean, certainly there were people in the lower middle class that were going to college, didn't take on any student loan debts. They were working. And you might say, well, how is that possible? The cost of university would go up a ton. Well, if you have to compete in a free market, how is someone going to, get 50 grand a year to go to this university unless they're really rich? Sure, you could say, well, now only rich people are going to go. But how much of the demographic of colleges are rich people? It's certainly some. But if you're losing 75, 80% of your target audience, of the people that would go to your school, then certainly you're going to lose money. And so you have to attract those people to your university somehow. So you have to lower costs. And I think a lot of universities are heavily bloated. And so what happens is they would have to take major haircuts and cut some bloat. And that's another problem is you think about these faculties. I mean, they're huge. I mean, how many educators are there? For every one educator, it's like 2 or 3 faculty members. So there's a lot of issues at universities. And the reason they're not being solved, like you think about a company, like a tech company, let's say something like Apple or Microsoft or Salesforce or one of these companies, they always have to remain relevant in the market. They always have to be offering better solutions at lower prices and better quality. And they always have to be shaving off fat, or else they're going to fall behind in the market. But because there's so much money, so much demand for these colleges, they can do whatever they want with the money. They can do all of this stuff. And it was all started by government. It was all started by this. And so what the government really should do, like I mentioned earlier, was get out of student loans. They should get out of it, and college prices would go way down, and I go into that. So a little bit, again, I go much more in-depth into that, right? But the point that I want to make is that the original argument was college got you ahead, right? And you had to do a little bit of sacrifice. You either had to work, you had to pay for tuition, and then it became more expensive, but the sacrifice was still worth it. But now, and then like, let's say 90s, 2000s, it became maybe not as much worth it. Someone else who couldn't afford it or maybe didn't want to take on so much debt, they were more responsible by not going. And so why should we punish the person who was more responsible? Because they knew that, hey, look, if they went to college, they'd just be shocked with debt. They wouldn't be that much further ahead because it's an average, right? Certainly everyone that graduates with a degree in computer science, electrical engineering, a STEM degree, certainly ends up ahead and much more ahead. But then someone that, graduates with maybe a degree in social work, which the question is, why does that require a college degree in the first place? But that's a whole other discussion. They're not that much further ahead. In fact, they're behind, and typically they have fewer job prospects. They have these things. Or, when I say fewer job prospects, maybe they have a more guaranteed job, but certainly the job quality in terms of pay is a lot less than, let's say, someone with a comp sci degree. And so that average is even skewed up. So maybe that the responsible person that knew, hey, I can't be an electrical engineer. I can't do this. Maybe I could do one of these other quote unquote fluff degrees or, worthless gender studies degrees. There was the old school MRS degree. That's still a thing in some universities. Not as common. MRS, if you don't know, is the Mrs. degree. You get a whatever degree, but you're there to find your husband who then works hard, whatever. It's an old school thing there. But the whole point is, do we want to punish that person who was responsible because they knew that they weren't going to get that high level degree? Maybe they could get that low level degree and not really be that far ahead. We don't want to punish those people. And so I agree with the Supreme Court decision. And again, you want to talk about the constitutionality. Obviously, it's there. The president can't do it if Congress wants to do it. I just spent the last 10 minutes talking about why Congress shouldn't do it. But if they did do it and they were able to sign it, then I think it would be, if someone were then sued, it would be 9-0 decision. The other way, the Supreme Court would say, absolutely, Congress, you're able to do this. And so that's the whole point that I want to talk about there. And then the last one, I know this one came out Thursday, so a lot more people are talking about over the weekend, the student loan debt forgiveness. But certainly, I think this is the most wide-ranging, most impacting, and I think the most important Supreme Court case of the four, because it's really going to transform our universities, in my opinion, and that is ending affirmative action at universities that receive government funds. There are exceptions with military universities, which I disagree with. I don't think they should be able to discriminate either, but whatever, right? I don't think anyone likes discrimination. I don't think anyone wants it. But if we think about, okay, can universities discriminate? The Supreme Court would take a look at the evidence, and there was already precedence on this in the Supreme Court. There was a case, I believe, in the mid-'90s, and forget who the justice who was in favor of that, or who wrote the majority decision on that, but they said, if there is state need, they can discriminate. And it was kind of a weak argument at the time. Okay, you have that, but of course, where else do you look at? Okay, first Constitution. Well, 14th Amendment, there's the equality phrase. It's not necessarily a clause in there. There's phrasing in there. And then, of course, what's built on top of that is the Civil Rights Act, which says you can't discriminate. To quote from Martin Luther King, not to judge someone on the color of their skin, but the content of their character, certainly, of that. And so that's kind of what the Civil Rights Act was based off of. Hey, we're all created equal under God. We're all, whether it doesn't matter if you're white or black, whatever, you shouldn't be discriminated based on the color of your skin, which I think we all agree is a good thing. But universities were doing it because they viewed that, and again, there's logic to this argument that African Americans, on average, were further behind economically. They didn't have as many educational opportunities. They certainly had lower income, on average, lower wealth. In fact, that wealth gap today is larger today than it was in 1920, which is crazy. Certainly, we're far less racist now than we were back then. I mean, there were still lynchings that were going on back then. Certainly not happening today. In that, and so, thank God that's not happening. But certainly, we were a lot more racist in the 1920s. Yet the wealth gap was greater, and so people are saying, well, they need an extra help up to get to these universities. So that's the argument. But again, the Supreme Court doesn't care about those arguments, about how much is this going to help someone? How much is this going to bring progress? And that's all the arguments that people on the left are bringing up. They're bringing up that, this is going to kill progress for African Americans. How dare you courts do this? But they don't care about that. Their argument is, the Supreme Court's decision is, can they do this? It's the means, not the ends. And so they look at the means. Okay, you're trying to bring in more African Americans. You're trying to bring more Hispanics into the universities. You're trying to curb the number of Asians in universities, certainly. Is that legal? And you take a look at 14th Amendment, you take a look at Civil Rights Act, and these universities that receive government funds cannot engage in that behavior. And I agree with that because it's government funds. Now, if you're a private institution, I don't know why you would and receive no government funds, which I don't think even exists. But if there were universities that did this, then they could discriminate based on race. And I think private businesses could discriminate based on race. In that case, I know I talked about earlier with the Christian web developer with the compelled speech, and I said that, hey, you shouldn't deny someone based on race. Look, a private business, ideally, this is let's say we didn't have the Civil Rights Act, which I think we should have the Civil Rights Act, but let's say we didn't have that, then a private business should be able to it would be idiotic to. I don't know why anyone would do that because you're denying customers. You want as many customers as possible. But a private business should. Now, should they actually? No. Like in terms of actually discriminating, no way. A private business should not discriminate. It's stupid. It's wrong. But from the perspective of the government, maybe should they be allowed to? I don't know. But we live in a Civil Rights Act world. We live in a world where we've all agreed that, hey, look, discrimination's wrong. And because of that, we can't do that. But in this college case, you can, because if you can promote diversity on campus, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So we go back to what the Supreme Court said, which was you can't discriminate on it because this breaks 14th Amendment, this breaks the Civil Rights Act, a bunch of issues, right? And for a fair point, they're looking at the means. They're not looking at the outcome. A lot of, again, people on the left are saying, well, this is going to kill progress. But I actually want to target that point because I don't think affirmative action is actually progress. Now, maybe you have people like Joy Reid on MSNBC literally saying, well, I wouldn't have gotten into Harvard if there wasn't affirmative action. You just outed yourself as a moron, I guess. I don't know. You just said you didn't qualify to go there. That's pretty wild. But let's focus on the argument at hand. These individuals who are African American on average come from lower income. They don't have as many educational opportunities. And so they should have lower requirements to get into Harvard, to get into Ivy League schools. That's the argument made by people who are for affirmative action. But I think that actually does them a greater disservice. And here's why. In fact, there's a debate between, I forget the two people. I think one of them might be Candace Owens, if I'm not mistaken. And the other, I'm not too sure, but it was around 2020, 2021. Someone, you could look it up. But there was a debate between these two individuals. And one thing that they both agreed on was this factoid by Thomas Sowell. I believe I think it had to be Thomas Sowell because obviously he's African American, one of the greatest thinkers of our time. Regardless of race. I mean, he's a very intelligent guy. Economically, just genius. I think he was at Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just gonna look that up. Was he ever? I don't know if he was ever at Harvard. Maybe it was another university, but it was an Ivy League, or maybe this was some other thinker. So just, you could pull up the full debate and it's in there. But they were saying that there was this person who was in charge of academic probation in an Ivy League school. And what they noticed were that African-American students made up 40% of the people on academic probation. And it was some number, it was like 30 to, it was like some number, I think 20 or 30% or even greater of African-American students were on probation, academic probation, meaning that your grades fell below a certain threshold that you could not, continue on. You would be dropped from your courses. You'd have to drop out. Not a good thing. Not a good thing, certainly. And, it's bad outcomes. And what this professor noticed was that a lot of these African-American students who, if they were to be accepted to the colleges that they could handle the rigor of these courses, because remember, Ivy League, they have the reputation of being, very difficult universities. And the people that graduate from there and the people that are alumni, they want the courses to be difficult. They want the rigor to be there so that if someone has that degree, someone has that diploma, that means something. If you go out and say, yeah, I'm a Harvard grad, that means a lot of companies want you because they know you're a great thinker. They know that you are intelligent, that you can handle whatever it is, that your brain is malleable, you can learn so many different things. There's value with a Harvard degree, and same thing with the different Ivies. And so they have a very difficult rigor. They bring in the top professors. They bring in these people. They know you're going to be well prepared for the workforce. Therefore, they have very tough rigor. Now, maybe they're trying to get rid of that, and that's a whole other discussion. But what this professor noticed was that these students who are on academic probation, who are African American, who got into these schools because of affirmative action, they would have been near the top of their class. And let's say a university at a slightly lower level. So you think about a University of North Carolina, a Duke, we come to Texas, SMU, TCU, Baylor, Texas A&M. Rice is pretty good. It's Ivy League of the South, so maybe not that. Very smart people go to Rice over there. But you think about it, a next level university, very good. You'd be near the top of your class. But you got into Harvard because of affirmative action. And these students were actually worse off because they got into Harvard. And you might say, well, wait a minute, how is it worse off they got into Harvard? They're going to have way more success. It's like 1 out of every 10 billionaires went to Harvard. Like all these success stories. But here's the thing. Would you rather be a magna cum laude, whatever, magna cum laude, summa cum laude, whatever, from a North Carolina, a Duke, a UCLA, a very, very good universities? No one's going to, disparage these universities. Or would you rather be a Harvard dropout? Now, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, okay, maybe, right? Or I think Bill Gates was an Ivy dropout, something like that. Okay, one in they're the exception, not the rule to the case of being a dropout. And so I think affirmative action actually does more damage to African American students because it misplaces them. And that was the whole thing, that both the liberal and conservative person in this debate about African American affirmative action, all of this stuff in this debate, they both agreed on was a problem. And I think that affirmative action hurts these people who would excel, who would, become great engineers, great lawyers, great whatever down the line. Great businessmen, accountants, tons of great majors, physicists. At these, again, North Carolina, Duke, Baylor, SMU, whatever university you want to put in that, not Ivy, but they have some very good programs. They're not Harvard, that's like number one in everything, or Stanford, but certainly they have some top 10 programs, and they're nationally ranked in the top whatever. Good universities. Okay, so I think affirmative action actually does more damage to those students. But the other thing that it does is the ones that actually belong there, that deserve to be there because they are geniuses, they are intelligent. Everyone just thinks they got there because of their race, and it actually damages their persona. And certainly, again, I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I'm just some doofus who recorded a podcast in Dallas, Texas. So I don't know anything about Ivy League stuff. But my guess is that if you went to an Ivy League school, you kind of hung around people that were like you. Right, you look at the university brochure. It's no one's like that. Maybe your freshman dorm's like that because you're around other people, but certainly by the time you can choose who you hang out with, you're hanging out with people like you, similar political beliefs. Unfortunately, a lot of times people that look similar to each other. That's the unfortunate thing. It gets very cliquish, and so this whole trying to just do it for diversity. There's better ways to do it, but the perception of this person, especially with affirmative action, is, oh, well, they're dumb. They shouldn't belong there, even though they should. Their merit is there. You think about a Condoleezza Rice. You think about a Cornel West. You think about a Thomas Sowell. Obviously, these people are some of the smartest people in rooms. They would be smarter than pretty much any white person in a room, any black person in a room, Hispanic, Asian, whatever. They're the top of their craft at what they do, regardless of race, right? But because of affirmative action, let's say they were a young college student, clearly above the pack, clearly geniuses, right? They would be getting 100%, my guess, in all their classes. People might judge it and say, well, hey, look, you're not doing this. And now that hurts the interpersonal relationships. And I actually think it does more damage to racial relationships there because people have that perception. And so it's a double whammy. It hurts these relationships more. It actually hurts African Americans and Hispanics because it gets them into situations that they weren't prepared for. And then the relationship, if you do make it and do deserve it and do graduate, now your reputation is tarnished simply because this program existed, even if you didn't need it. And so that's a problem there. That's a problem, certainly. So let's go back to a point that a lot of people make, which is, well, these people, they clearly don't have enough. And that's true. A lot of people grow up in areas that don't have good educational stuff, or they grow up in a household, let's say, without a father, without a good support structure. How do these people get good educational opportunities? And so how can you treat them fair? Like if they can't get an Ivy League school, how are they going to get ahead? Well, certainly I don't think you have to go to an Ivy League school to get ahead. Certainly, and we think about student loan debt, you probably, tacking on $200,000 of student loan debt, probably not the best financial decision you would make in your life. But, okay, how do you get people ahead, right? Well, I think one, better quality education from K to 12 is obviously needed. You take a look at how many real life skills are taught K through 12 that people use in their everyday, right? Sure, arithmetic, but okay, that's always been used, right? If you work as a cashier, you need to know basic arithmetic, you need to know numbers, you need to know conversational skills, certainly at all levels. But how much of high school history, how much of what someone learns from ages 14 to 18 are really used in a workforce? It's not very much, right? It's not as useful. And you even think about the college degree, it's certainly not as useful. But it's what I brought back to, and it's still somewhat the case, is it's your ability to learn. And if you have a degree in electrical engineering, let's say, you have a very good foundation of maybe the specific area you're going to go into. So let's say you go into RF circuit design for let's say a company like a Raytheon, defense contractors, Bell Helicopter, the nuclear submarine research labs, whatever the case happens to be. You have a very good foundation, and sure, you might not know the data sheets of all this stuff, and certainly you don't have to take tests. It's more about writing. It's more about actually designing these things. It's about and you have access to programs, but you have that foundation, so they don't have to teach you everything. They can teach you the job specifics, and so you can provide more value earlier, and you're less of risk because you made it through the rigor of an electrical engineering degree. That's not easy, right? So there's value there. So my whole thing is, okay, why can't we bring that to high schools? Why can't high schools offer more job-specific training to individuals? And why aren't there apprenticeships? Why aren't there all these things? There's a lot of things that are missing. I think high schools could bring back useful skills like auto shop or wood shop, or even they call it home ec or whatever. But these are important skills that I think both women and men could have. Like, so for instance, in home ec they teach cooking and cleaning and all that. Basically, again, if you look at it from the hey, women must take home ec, yeah, it's kind of a very misogynistic sexist view of it. But those are useful skills. Like, everyone should know how to cook a little bit. Everyone should know how to balance a checkbook. Everyone should know, budgeting and finance and all these things. And I think those are important skills that high schools should teach. But that's not happening, right? What is happening is you have a lot of teachers unions going out there and saying, what we need is more money. What we need to help these underprivileged African-American, Hispanic students is we need more money in our educational system. Well, we spend a lot of money on our educational system. In fact, we spend a fortune on it. We spend $13,000 per student. In the late 70s, just put in perspective, was $2,500, I believe, anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000. Obviously, it's a national average. Each state's going to be a little bit different, and for good reason. California is a lot more expensive than Mississippi, so cost of living certainly is a factor. Of that, of course, the tax revenue you bring in, another factor. Based on property taxes, that's how education works. So, for instance, a state like California might not have as much money because of Prop 13. They limit tax increases by 2% a year. By, I think it was since '79 they've been doing that, maybe. And so because of that, you're going to be limited. But they still spend more than most states. But the state that spends the most is New York. They spend, on average, $25,000 per student, which is crazy. That's wild. So if a teacher were to teach a classroom of 30 students, there is a budget of that classroom of $750,000. Now, if you're not paying the teacher at least a third of that, let's say total benefit, total package of $250,000, what are you doing? Where is this money going? And I think that's the real problem with our educational system, is that the money's not being spent efficiently because there's not competition. There isn't, you think about it, it's a very monopolistic thing. There isn't school choice in these things. People don't have school vouchers in most states. They have to either go to the public school, or if you're rich, yeah, you can afford to go to some fancy smancy private school that's like $25,000. But if you're middle class making $50,000, $60,000 a year, you can't send your kid to one of those. That's a third of your income. How are you going to do that? You already give, let's say, $10,000, $15,000 to the federal government. You give some of your state tax. You got to pay rent. You got to get food. You got to pay your car payment. You got to, get insurance, pay for gas, right? Save up for the retirement, all these things. You can't afford to send your kid to a school that costs like that, even if it was $10,000, even if you lived in a state where educational funding was $10,000 in a state school costs $10,000, and you had to fork over that $10,000. Most people couldn't afford that outright. Probably the upper middle class and rich could, obviously, but the middle class certainly couldn't. And I think that's where you see the biggest differences in educational disparities. It's income. And you see it where if you live in New York City, all the rich kids are sending their kids to these private schools, $50,000 a year. I always see news articles about this private school sent this message home with the parents or this or that. And there's always stuff going on. And I always hear it's $50,000 a year. That's more than my college education costs. That's wild. And that's like without scholarships. That's without any student loans. That's without any assistance. That's without anything. And that's more. So that's wild that these schools cost $50,000. But of course they have, what's the population or of the students versus the teacher, the ratio of that. There's probably like 10 students per teacher. There's probably every program in the book. And so the people that are in favor of affirmative action look at this and say, well, the rich are getting these insanely nice schools and they're doing this. How can someone who's poor compete with this? I don't think the answer, like I mentioned, was affirmative action. I don't think that's the answer because you're going to be put in a situation they're ill prepared for, because you can't get that muscle, that learning muscle. If let's say you went to high school that had no AP programs, that had garbage there, your home life sucked, your muscle, your brain, your learning muscle will not be able to keep up with an Ivy League school, which sucks. That's terrible. But the solution isn't to dumb down Ivy League schools. We want the best and brightest. We want to know who's the best and brightest. We want kids to excel. We want the best of the best. That's what makes America so good, is that people come all around the world, come to America for education, right? You get Chinese foreign exchange students, you get a lot of people in Europe. Why? Because we have the best universities. Maybe not the best university system in terms of cost, certainly we're very cost prohibitive, but a lot of people send their kids here. Why? Because they know that there's quality in the education in the university level, certainly not in the K through 12 level, or else they would be coming to America for K through 12. But they come to America for university, and maybe it's a little bit easier because you're an adult. But these universities have programs to have these kids excel, and that's the genius part of it, right? These kids, if you think about an Ivy League school, these are the best, brightest young kids. We don't want to dumb them down to make other people feel included. We want to give them rocket fuel. We don't want to do equality by subtraction. We want to try to do equality by addition, right? We want to say, hey, you don't have this. Hey, how do we get this to you without taking away from someone else? So I think this goes back to, hey, we need to fix our K through 12 to reduce the educational inequities. Don't just, dumb it down to the college level, which actually ends up screwing people. But instead, what we should do is say, hey, how can we make K through 12 more fair? How can we give school choice? Because that, by the way, that's what all these rich people that send their kids to private schools have. They have school choice. How do we give that to everyone? How do we give school choice to everyone? And you have to have school, voucher programs, programs. There's competition, and of course, competition breeds innovation and all of these things. That's what we need in education. Not just more money, throw more money pit at the problem. In fact, there's tons of content out there by different creators. I know there's a John Stossel video. Very much highly regard this individual. He's a great, newscaster. He's someone who's very phenomenal reporting on stories. And one of the things that he reported on specifically was there was a school district in Newark, New Jersey, that spent $30,000 per student, and the education quality was low. Now, the teachers' unions, they blame the students, which, if you take a look at the demographics of the students, I would say that's a very racist statement, all right? Because the students, the demographics at these schools that underperform are primarily African American. That, they say, that's just their fault. We just need more money. We need more money, but then they don't get results. And they're like, well, in order to get results, we need more money. But wait a minute, you just said we gave you more money and we didn't get results. So what are we doing? And then look, in the private sector, that's not how it works. If you get money for a project and you don't deliver, your department gets shut down. Your business goes under. But apparently in teachers' unions, if a school underperforms, they just give more money. It's idiotic. And so what they need is competition. Because right now this money is being severely wasted, and they go into like Teamsters unions, they go into all these things. That money is wasted. It's basically, I don't want to say money laundering. It's not as egregious as that, but there's certainly people pilfering from every different direction trying to take money out. And eventually these teachers don't make that much money. I mean, they make some, certainly. They make more than the national average. But it's not like they're rolling in like Bentleys or anything like that. They're not making lawyer money. They're not making doctor money. They're just making a teacher salary in the area. But yet these, $30,000 a year per student, that's a ton, right? If you were to compare that to the state on average that has the least amount of educational spending, that's Idaho. They spend it's like $7,600 to $8,000 per student. Yet no one talked about educational inequalities there, about how we need to help the kids of Idaho get into universities. Why? Well, because they're 92% white. They don't look at that. They only want to look at it if there's race, which is a problem. I think that's why these programs to get rid of affirmative action are a good thing. And what can be done at the university level to not, let's say, even the playing field, but to give people a chance. Right. And the right people a chance. Again, we don't want the educational inequities where someone comes up certainly unprepared and goes down. But then how do we get, the ideal situation, which is, hey, look, if this person wasn't as poor, if this person didn't have all these issues going around with them, if they were to go into a controlled environment like a university, they would excel just as much as this kid that went to a private school, had like 12 tutors, was in, gazillion different programs, all this. How do we make that happen? Well, you don't have to look at race. You can look at income. You could take a look at the average high school area. It takes more work, but you can discriminate based on that. And the Supreme Court said that's fine to do that. And I think that's what needs to happen. It's not a race issue. And see, this is the whole thing is I don't think the problems in this country are race issues. I think it's primarily a class issue. Because look, affirmative action, like I mentioned, doesn't necessarily help the poor African-American student because sure, some of them succeed, but the most often thing is that they end up on probation, they drop out. The ones that it helps are the rich ones, the rich African-American children who go to these universities. If you're in the top, I saw some numbers, if you were in the top 40% of your class, you had like a 40% chance of getting to an Ivy League school. If you're white and you're the top 40%, it's like 3% or 4%. And if it's Asian, it's like 1%, basically. You have to be in the top like 2% of your class, basically, to get into an Ivy League school. So if you're someone that grows up in a very rich African-American household, you then will be favored to go into this university, even if you didn't face hardship. Like, sure, yeah, your race, sure, certain people might judge you and you might be a little bit worse off than a rich white person. Okay, that's a fair argument. But are you really worse off than a poor kid from Appalachia or a poor Asian immigrant that came over from Vietnam to live in some little Saigon somewhere in California and they're struggling to make it? They got to work at their parents' restaurant or something like that. Is that person's life really that much worse than them? No, their life is so much better than that poor kid. That the African American kid's life is so much better than that child. The immigrant child or the poor kid in Appalachia or whatever it was, whatever the situation is, class is a lot more of an indicator of how good your life was than race, in my opinion. And so I think these universities are now actually going to do a better job of surveying hardship. And look, yes, on average, African Americans face higher hardship on average than whites. But there are certainly situations that there are white people that have it worse off than black people. But if you just do it based on affirmative action and like, oh, we need a more diverse campus, then you're just going to completely ignore poor white, poor Asian kids because, well, there's already too many of them. We don't need more of them. But then they had less educational resources. They had all this bad stuff. Yet, if they do decently, they should have a shot, right? According to this. And they don't. And so I think overall, this was, again, I know I went on some tangents here. I spent like 30 minutes talking about it. So thank you for listening on these ramblings here. But I think overall this decision is going to be good. People are going to have to look at hardships, which, again, takes work, takes time. And look, if more Asians get in, if more whites who, especially if they faced hardship, get into these universities, and excel, then isn't that a good thing? If graduation rates go up, if more people can take the rigor of the courses, if underrepresented groups are now getting into college, I don't think that's a bad thing. But it should be, again, it should always be in the guise of, hey, not just, hey, let's check a box, let's get someone in here, and who cares about their academic success? It should be focused on, hey, couldn't this person actually academically succeed? And I think that doesn't often get answered at these university levels. I think oftentimes they're like, hey, they had a decent GPA in high school. They went to a poor high school. They had a decent GPA. Their SAT score was good enough. Okay, we'll let them in. But if the SAT score is, let's say, 300 to 400 points behind, let's say, the average Asian American student, well, then they're going to be way further behind on that. So, again, I think colleges should try to have the best interests of their students and let people in who they think could actually handle the course load. And if that is more people that have, are from poor situations, and okay, then I think that's overall a good thing. And that should be the lens of what you do it, not, hey, let's check a box, let's do this. And that's what was happening in universities. As much as they want to admit that's not what was happening, that is what happens. And, in fact, so much so that it was happening that, there was a scholarship fund that Charles Barkley had for Auburn University that was for poor students, or that it was in his will, or some thing of that nature, that it was specifically, for low-income people, which I think is a genuinely good thing. Hey, someone who can't afford to go to college, you make a scholarship for them. It's in the private sector. That's a good thing. He then changed it to, well, I want to make sure Auburn stays black, that there are enough black kids going here. And it's like, yes, I get the point where you want to be represented. You want that. But wasn't the goal to help someone who was underserved? And yes, on average, African Americans are underserved. So I get that. But I would say if you were to take a look at class lines, which is a discriminatable thing, I would say the contrasts are far worse there. And without school choice, without voucher programs, without competition, these things aren't going to get fixed. And so I think that's the guise in which this should be looked at. But again, people care more about the color of the skin than the content of their character. And I think that's a problem. And so I'm going to end it here. Thank you for listening. Hope y'all had a good day. Once again, happy birthday, America. And I hopefully will be recording another podcast soon. Thank you.